All right, we're going to talk about rubrics now. As you know, rubrics are a great tool that can really help students know what is expected and also can help you in the grading process. So let's start off by defining what rubrics are. So they're really assessment tools that clearly articulate the elements or the dimensions of an assignment or program that are being assessed. So it provides detailed information about what constitutes high, medium, and low quality performance on each of the elements or dimensions identified. So why do we want to use rubrics? Well, clearly rubrics are a way for us to communicate with our students about what's important, what our expectations are, can also add clarity to the purpose of the assignment. In addition, it also helps us with our grading. It keeps us more honest and fair and consistent. There's many times that faculty talk about starting with a big packet of papers, and if they're not using a rubric, they kind of feel about midway through they might have changed kind of the way in which they were grading, and they need to kind of start back at the top again to make sure they're being fair to all their students. Well, rubrics can kind of keep us honest and on point as to that consistency factor. And the truth is if you provide students with rubrics, you will generally get better products from them because if they know what's expected, they're often happy to meet your expectations. So it really can make a much more pleasant grading experience for you as well. Because no one wants to grade papers or projects that are not at the level that you're expecting them to be. So this can really be a helpful tool in that process. So there are different kinds of rubrics, and it really depends on what your needs are. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the different types. We'll start off by looking at rubric checklist. This is the most simple type of rubric, and as you can see from the example, you basically list on the left-hand side all of the elements or parts that you need, and then it's either present or not present. So that's why it's a checklist, yes or no. It's no, no really looking at quality, but basically did they kind of hit all these points? And we can take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of this type of rubric. Well, first of all, it's very easy to create. So it is the simplest rubric to create. But one of the big disadvantages is that you do not really get to evaluate quality. So it depends on what your purpose is if you're really just making sure that they have hit several points, like for instance, maybe in a reflective journaling kind of situation where they're not bringing in outside research and it's really their own ideas, you don't want to grade them on the quality necessarily of their own reflection, but maybe they need to reflect on, point A, point B, and point C. So they would get kind of checks or points for that. But if you want to provide them with useful information about how to improve, that's not going to happen really with a checklist rubric. Somebody gets it back and they might know something's missing, but they won't really know how to improve it outside of just making sure they don't miss any elements. So now there's another type of rubric which is called holistic rubrics. And this is really when you kind of think of kind of a project as a whole, and maybe it's difficult to compartmentalize and think of the different components. It's kind of like, it's good and you can tell, from the overall picture. If you think about something one of the workshops I went to on rubric design, they focus on a chocolate chip cookie. Well, it's not, you might be able to define texture, number of chips, different components of a cookie, but you just kind of know if it's a good cookie when you eat it. So, if you enjoy it, then it's a good cookie. So sometimes it's hard to do the analytical rubric, which we're going to talk about in a moment, because it really is just kind of a big picture issue. So here's what like a holistic rubric would look like. You'd have kind of, well, here's what an A looks like, and you could describe the A in general. And here's what a B or a C looks like. So you certainly can kind of give that big picture rather than compartmentalizing everything. Give them a vision of what a solid A paper or project really looks like. Now, of course, there's advantages and disadvantages also of the holistic rubric. So again, it's pretty easy to develop. It's a little more time consuming than the checklist rubric, but not that challenging overall. And if you're trying to provide some general feedback, it's great. But here's where it falls apart a little bit. Let's say a student did part of it, but not the other part. So if I go back here for a minute, so maybe they had 4 more accurate concepts, but maybe it was not in a visually appealing fashion. Well, does that mean they still get a 3, or do you bump them down to a 2? So you can see how, if one of the parts is missing, something's not quite in sync, what does that mean? And what often happens with the holistic rubric is that people then take those and average them out, and then you kind of have a grade that doesn't provide students with a whole lot of specific feedback about what's meaningful, and what strategies they can really use to improve what they're doing. So the analytical rubric is kind of the king of rubrics, I would say, and it's a very specific, detailed type of rubric. It lists all the criteria, but it also lists different types of performance levels. So for here, in this particular example, you'll see the criteria on the left-hand side over here, but then across the top you have poor, adequate, excellent. Obviously, there can be different, some of them have 4 levels, some have 5 levels. I do suggest if you're going to start off, 3 levels is probably enough. This is a very challenging rubric to design. It's very hard to differentiate. Well, what do I mean? And what does differentiate something between adequate or excellent, or poor and adequate? Sometimes it's not so hard to do poor, and it may not be so hard to do excellent, but it may be hard to figure out, well, what does that in between look like? So again, you can see here that they are very specific, and there are criteria for each of the different content, visual aid, organizational, and source components of the project. So this certainly provides students with a very comprehensive look, and they would be able to look over here in the excellent column to see how, what you're looking for really in that assignment. Now, when we look at the advantages and disadvantages, clearly the expectation is very, very clear. There's a high level of specificity in this type of rubric, and it really provides a lot more consistency for you as the instructor when you're grading it. However, some of the downsides is extremely time consuming and difficult to develop, especially when you're trying to differentiate again between what is the difference between an A, a B, and a C. Very, very challenging. But one of the things you can do, a student's going to get very specific feedback because maybe they get excellent for content and maybe they get adequate for visual aids. Well, then as they get their score and it kind of comes out with their different categories here, they know which components they need to work on. So it can be a very valuable tool for students, but sometimes it feels a little arbitrary. It is challenging to develop an analytical rubric and make sure that it's still very meaningful. So yes, it's a great tool, but it is something that you need to invest quite a bit of time in before you just kind of throw one together. All right, so let's look at a couple other considerations with this analytical rubric. First, you want to think about, well, how many criteria and how many factors do you want to include? So how many parts of the project do you want? And then you want to determine, well, how many layers or anchors in terms of quality do you want to include? I would usually say around 3 is a good starting point, but if you're trying to differentiate between A, a B, a C, a D, and F, then you might need 5. So it really depends. The other thing is you don't have to weigh them all equally. So if we go back here a minute, maybe content is a primary one, and this might even be 50% of the grade, and visual aid might be 25% or something like that. So you could, weight the different parts a little differently. You want to think about what matters most in terms of that assignment. All right, so let's say you bought into this idea of rubrics, you think it's a good idea. How do I go about creating one? Well, the first thing is you probably already have a mental rubric, because if you've been assigning assignments and grading them, you're using some kind of criteria that's already up here in your mind. It's just about getting that onto paper. A great starting point is to review previous assignments. Now, if it's a brand new class, obviously, then you may not have anything up here to pull from, and you'll have to spend a little bit more time thinking about, well, what is it that I'm looking for? And you may want to even talk to a colleague or even look for sample rubrics online. So this is where the second stage comes in. You really want to think about, well, what type of rubric is going to best work for this assignment? Is it the checklist, the holistic, the analytical rubric? And then you can look for models. You don't always need to start from square one. There's a lot of samples out there online you can look at and maybe modify and tweak to meet your needs. Or some faculty really like to start from scratch and create their own, so it's very unique and fitting to their assignment. Then you want to write it out, so you determine the criteria, you draft it out. That's really important. And as I said before, one of the most challenging parts is differentiating those different quality levels, excellent, adequate, poor, etc. And then you don't want to skip this step. This is a really important one. You want to try to evaluate the rubric. And the best thing that you can do is, if you have any papers or samples, then you can just use it to see, is it working? Is that the grade I had up here, and is it getting calculated correctly based on the rubric? So the idea here is that you want to test drive it by trying it out, maybe asking students and faculty colleagues to take a look at it and provide you with some feedback. There are a couple of traps that you do want to use, and I'm telling you, I'm guilty of them myself, because it's very easy to fall into these traps. you want to try to avoid the words like excellent, adequate, and poor in the actual descriptor. So they're going to be on the top column, but then what does that mean to be excellent? That's what you have to describe in that box. So, what an excellent work looks like. Does it have this kind of, component? Does it have this in it? Does it have that in it? So try to avoid, obviously they know that's differentiating the quality components, but you need to articulate what does that mean exactly for students. So as I said before, you definitely want to engage in evaluating your rubric. So you want to look at some things like, is it visually appealing, easy to use? Is it like 10 pages long and overwhelming? Or is it kind of clear and focused, a nice one-page rubric? Is it clearly linked to your learning outcomes and the purpose of the assignment? Did you include all the criteria that really matters to you? And have you, identified the terms clearly and differentiated between those quality indicators? So those are some of the strategies you can use to try to get yourself, in the habit of helping students by creating the rubrics. All right. I hope that you enjoyed this and will also find value in the readings and all to become better at using rubrics. It is a very challenging task, but I know that you can do it.